It is 3:17 in the morning on a quiet residential street in Cardiff, Wales, and Daniel Whitfield is asleep beside his wife when a strange orange light begins to flicker against the bedroom curtains. At first he thinks it's a passing car. Then he hears it, a low, cracking roar, unmistakable to anyone who has ever stood near a structure fire. He is at the window in seconds. The house next door, belonging to his neighbor Rachel Ainsworth and her 7-year-old daughter Lily, is burning. Daniel is not a professional firefighter. By day he restores antique furniture in a small workshop behind his house. But for 5 years he has served as a retained, on-call firefighter with the local brigade, trained, certified, and on this particular night, the only person on the street who knows exactly what to do in the 90 seconds before it's too late. He doesn't wait for a truck. He doesn't wait for a phone call to connect. He runs across the frost-covered lawn in bare feet, hammers on the front door, and gets nothing back but the muffled roar of flame consuming a staircase. The door is locked, the smoke already curling under the frame in thick, oily ribbons. He circles the house once, twice, screaming Rachel's name, banging on windows, before he finds a side window low enough to reach. He drives his elbow through the glass, then his forearm, clearing the frame of jagged edges with his bare hands, and pulls himself inside. What happens over the next 4 minutes will define the rest of Daniel Whitfield's life, in ways no one standing on that lawn could have imagined. Inside, the smoke is nearly zero visibility. Daniel drops to the floor, where the air is marginally clearer, and crawls forward by memory and instinct, sweeping his arms in front of him. He finds Lily first, curled beneath her bed in the smaller of the 2 upstairs rooms, coughing, terrified, her small hands pressed over her face exactly as she'd been taught in a school fire drill months earlier. Daniel wraps her in a blanket pulled from the bed, presses her face into his shoulder, and half carries, half drags her back toward the broken window, his own lungs already burning. He gets Lily out. Neighbors who have gathered on the pavement take her from his arms. And then, against every piece of his own training, which tells him never to re-enter a structure alone, Daniel turns and goes back in for Rachel. He doesn't find her in time. The heat by then has become nearly unsurvivable. The ceiling above the staircase is already sagging, timber popping like gunfire. Firefighters arriving 7 minutes later will pull Daniel out through the same window. His hands and forearms burned so severely that skin grafts will be needed on both. Rachel Ainsworth does not survive the fire. By the next morning, Daniel Whitfield is a local hero. The South Wales Echo runs his photograph under the headline, "The Man Who Ran Into the Fire." Well-wishers leave flowers at his gate. A hospital chaplain visits his bedside and tells him, simply, not many men would have gone back in a second time. Daniel, heavily sedated, barely registers the words. He is thinking only of Rachel Ainsworth and of the fact that he could not find her in time. Reporters camp briefly outside the family home. Sarah gives one short statement on the doorstep, her voice shaking. "My husband is not a hero. He would tell you himself. He just did what anyone should have done." Within a week, the cameras move on to other stories, and the Whitfield family is left, for a short while, in a strange and fragile peace. Burned hands healing, a community's gratitude still warm, no one yet imagining what is coming. What no one in that community knows, what Daniel himself has no way of knowing, lying in a hospital bed with his hands wrapped in gauze, is that in exactly 21 days, police will arrive at his door not to thank him, but to arrest him for murder. To understand how a rescue became a murder charge, you first have to understand who Daniel Whitfield was before that night, because almost everything the prosecution would later use against him was, in truth, simply evidence of an ordinary life. Daniel was 34 years old, a carpenter and furniture restorer by trade, married to Sarah for 9 years, father to 2 young children, Jack and Poppy. Neighbors describe a man who was, if anything, almost too willing to help. The one who'd stop his van on the roadside for a stray dog, who ran a free basic car maintenance clinic for elderly residents on Saturday mornings, who had joined the retained fire service not for money. The pay was minimal, but because, as his wife put it later, he genuinely could not walk past someone in trouble. His workshop, a converted garage behind the family home, was filled with the ordinary tools of a furniture restorer's trade. Sandpaper, wood stain, varnish, and critically, several tins of paint thinner and cellulose-based solvents used to strip old finishes from antique pieces before refinishing them. None of this was unusual. Thousands of hobbyists and tradespeople across the country keep identical chemicals in home workshops. But 3 weeks after the fire, when forensic investigators swabbed the boots Daniel had worn that night, they found faint chemical traces that would later be matched, imperfectly, and as we'll see wrongly, to compounds found at the fire's point of origin. At the time, no one thought to ask the obvious question. Could those traces have come from Daniel's own workshop, transferred onto his boots through ordinary daily contact, and then further contaminated by the broken glass and scorched debris he crawled through during the rescue itself? That question would not be seriously asked for 9 years. What the investigators saw instead was a narrative that, once suggested, proved impossible to shake. A devoted family man, trained in firefighting, with ready access to accelerant-like chemicals, arriving suspiciously fast at the fire, entering not once but twice, emerging as the story's unquestioned hero. To a skeptical detective looking for a neat explanation, heroism itself began to look like performance. Sarah Whitfield would later testify that this was the cruelest irony of the entire case. The very qualities that made Daniel run into a burning building to save a child he barely knew, his competence, his fearlessness, his willingness to act while everyone else stood frozen on the pavement, were the same qualities the prosecution would spend a trial recasting as calculation. Daniel's fire service training officer, Gareth Price, would later describe him as one of the calmest heads I ever trained, the sort of retained firefighter who runs toward the noise instead of away from it every single time. Price kept detailed logs of every training session Daniel attended over 5 years. Not one missed drill, not one safety violation. A spotless record that stood in stark contrast to the picture prosecutors would eventually paint of a man secretly capable of an act of calculated violence against a neighbor he had known, by all accounts, only casually and cordially. It's worth pausing here on something easy to overlook. Daniel and Rachel Ainsworth were not close friends, but they were exactly the kind of neighbors who wave across a fence, who trade spare eggs and lawnmowers, who exchange a few words at the school gate when picking up their children. There was no history of conflict between them, no dispute over a boundary or a noise complaint, nothing in 9 years of living 20 feet apart that investigators could ever point to as a motive. And yet, once the chemical traces were found, the absence of a motive stopped mattering nearly as much as it should have. To understand how thin the case against Daniel truly was, it helps to walk through the timeline investigators reconstructed years later, once they finally looked at all the evidence rather than the evidence that fit their theory. CCTV from a doorbell camera 2 houses down, footage that existed from the very first day, but was never properly analyzed during the original investigation, shows Daniel emerging from his own front door at 3:18 a.m., barefoot, in pajama trousers, sprinting across his lawn. He circles Rachel's house completely once, visible for 11 full seconds, crossing from the side path to the back garden and around to the front again, clearly searching for another entry point. He is seen banging on the front door with both fists. He is seen trying, and failing, to force the handle. Only after this full circuit does he move to the side window and break the glass. This detail matters enormously, because the prosecution's entire theory rested on the idea that Daniel had already been inside the house before the fire started, and that his rescue was theater performed for the benefit of arriving neighbors. The doorbell footage, unexamined for years, directly contradicts that theory. A man staging a rescue does not spend 11 seconds searching for a way in before an audience has even gathered. Once inside, Daniel's actions match textbook fire rescue procedure almost exactly. Procedure that, notably, an arsonist staging a false rescue would have no particular reason to know or follow under genuine panic and zero visibility. He stays low. He sweeps methodically. He finds Lily by touch in the dark, coughing on smoke so thick that firefighters arriving minutes later would describe it as blackout conditions, a level of smoke density in which even trained crews with breathing apparatus operate by feel alone. Getting Lily out took, by the doorbell camera's timestamp, approximately 90 seconds. Daniel's second entry, the one in search of Rachel, lasted just under 2 minutes before the arriving fire crew physically pulled him from the building as the staircase began to collapse. Paramedics treated him at the scene for burns to both hands, his forearms, and mild smoke inhalation. He was still on oxygen in the back of an ambulance when a police family liaison officer first came to take his account of events. A conversation that, transcribed months later, would be quoted selectively at trial to suggest inconsistency where there was, in fact, simply a man in shock and pain doing his best to recall 4 minutes of the worst night of his life. Rachel Ainsworth's body was recovered by the full fire crew 20 minutes after Daniel was pulled out. The post-mortem would later confirm what should have been central to the entire case from the beginning. She had died of smoke inhalation, not of any injury consistent with an assault, and the timeline of her death was consistent with a fire that had already been burning, undetected, for close to 10 minutes before Daniel ever woke up. None of this complexity made it into the story investigators told themselves in the weeks that followed. Lily Ainsworth, in a statement she gave years later as a teenager reviewing the case herself, described fragments of memory from those 90 seconds that never appeared in any official report. The way Daniel kept repeating her name in a low, steady voice the entire time he searched for her. Not shouting, she said, but almost soothing, as though he understood that panic in a 7-year-old would waste precious seconds. She remembered the blanket smelling of wood smoke and, faintly, of sawdust from his workshop. She remembered being handed to a neighbor on the pavement and looking back to see Daniel already turning to go back inside. That detail, a rescuer voluntarily returning into a structure fire for a second, far more dangerous entry, alone, without backup, without breathing apparatus, is not the behavior forensic psychologists would expect from someone who had moments earlier deliberately set the building alight. It is, however, exactly the kind of instinctive, high-risk action retained firefighters are trained to resist making alone, and that Daniel made anyway, because the woman he could not find was someone he knew. Fire investigator Graham Pierce had spent over 20 years determining the causes of house fires across South Wales, and by his own account, he trusted his instincts. Those instincts told him, walking through the burned-out shell of Rachel Ainsworth's living room 3 days after the fire, that something about the burn pattern behind the sofa looked wrong. Too intense, too localized, for what he initially assumed was an electrical fault. Pierce took samples from the carpet and skirting board near the point of origin and sent them to a laboratory for chemical analysis. The report came back describing volatile hydrocarbon compounds consistent with a petroleum-based accelerant. In isolation, that finding meant relatively little. Plenty of household materials, including certain carpet adhesives and furniture varnishes, can register similar chemical signatures under older testing methods. But Pierce did not treat it in isolation. Within the same week, in the course of routine background checks on the man being celebrated in the local press as a hero, he learned that Daniel Whitfield kept several tins of paint thinner and cellulose solvent in his workshop, less than 40 feet from the house that had burned. To Pierce, this was not a coincidence. It was a pattern. He requested that Daniel's boots, the same boots he'd been wearing during the rescue, still bagged as evidence from the night of the fire, be tested for chemical residue. The results showed trace compounds broadly similar to those found at the point of origin. What Pierce's investigation never did, not once at any stage, was test an equally obvious alternative explanation: that those same chemical traces on Daniel's boots had come from his own workshop floor through ordinary daily use, and had then mixed with soot, broken glass, and charred debris when he waded through the wreckage of a house fire to save a child. No control sample was ever taken from Daniel's workshop floor for direct comparison. No one asked whether cellulose-based solvent residue, naturally present on a hobbyist's boots, might chemically resemble compounds released when a carpet, its underlay, and synthetic furniture foam burn at high temperature. Something forensic chemists would later confirm is disturbingly easy to conflate under the older, presumptive testing methods used in this case. 21 days after the fire, at 6 in the morning, 2 unmarked police cars pulled up outside the Whitfield home. Daniel was still asleep, his bandaged hands resting on top of the duvet, when officers knocked. He was arrested in front of his own children, handcuffed in the driveway in his pajamas, and driven to the local station on suspicion of arson and manslaughter, a charge that would, within the year, be upgraded to murder. Sarah Whitfield remembers standing in the doorway holding Poppy, who was 3 years old at the time, watching her husband, burned hands and all, being placed in the back of a police car, and thinking, with a kind of numb disbelief, that surely, someone would realize this was a mistake before it went any further. No one did. Not for 9 years. At the police station that morning, Daniel, still in visible pain from his healing burns, still attending twice-weekly hospital appointments for his skin grafts, was interviewed for almost 6 hours without a solicitor present for the first 90 minutes. A procedural gap his defense team would later argue had compromised his ability to properly explain the chemical presence in his workshop before that explanation was ever formally recorded. By the time his solicitor arrived, the interview transcript already contained several tired, imprecise answers that the prosecution would later present in court as evasive. Detective Inspector Rian Cole, who led the investigation, would tell a documentary crew years afterward, long after the conviction was quashed, that she remembered a colleague raising the workshop contamination question early on, informally, in a corridor conversation, and that it was noted, but not pursued as a priority line of inquiry, because by that point the case narrative had already, in her words, started to feel solved. It is a small, human admission that captures exactly how wrongful convictions so often happen, not through malice, but through the quiet, compounding weight of an investigation that stops asking questions once it believes it already has the answer. The trial of Daniel Whitfield opened at Cardiff Crown Court 14 months after the fire, and from the outset, the prosecution built its case less on hard forensic certainty than on narrative persuasion, a strategy that would prove devastatingly effective. Graham Pierce took the stand as the Crown's central expert witness. His testimony was confident, fluent, and delivered with the unshakable authority of a man who had investigated hundreds of fires. He described the chemical match between the point of origin in Daniel's boots as not something that happens by accident, language that, to a jury with no independent forensic training, sounded very much like the certainty of a DNA match, even though the underlying chemistry was, in reality, nowhere near that precise. Daniel's defense barrister argued, correctly, that paint thinner is one of the most common substances in Britain, found in millions of garages and workshops, and that no comparison sample had ever been taken from Daniel's own workshop to rule out an innocent explanation. But expert versus expert testimony is a difficult thing for a jury to weigh, and the defense, funded through legal aid, on a fraction of the budget the Crown had available, could not afford to bring in an independent forensic fire chemist of their own to directly rebut Pierce's findings in the same courtroom, in front of the same jury. The emotional center of the trial belonged, understandably, to Rachel Ainsworth's family. Her sister told the jury, through tears, "The man who is supposed to be a hero is the reason my sister is dead," a line that would be repeated in nearly every news report covering the trial. It is impossible to overstate how much weight a grieving family's raw testimony carries in a courtroom, and how difficult it becomes, once that testimony has landed, for a jury to hold onto scientific nuance. The defense called character witnesses, fellow firefighters, neighbors, Daniel's fire service training officer, all of whom testified to his competence, his composure under pressure, and the complete absence of any prior conflict with Rachel Ainsworth that might explain a motive. The prosecution had never actually offered a motive at all. The case rested almost entirely on opportunity and the disputed chemical evidence. After 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on 1 count of arson with intent to endanger life and 1 count of manslaughter. Daniel Whitfield was sentenced to 16 years in prison. As the verdict was read, Sarah Whitfield rose from the gallery and shouted, "He went in to save her. He went in twice," words that would appear in the following morning's newspapers, but changed nothing about the sentence her husband would now serve. Daniel Whitfield, badly burned hands and all, was let out of Cardiff Crown Court in handcuffs, a convicted killer in the eyes of the law, exactly 9 months after being celebrated in that same city as a hero. Outside the courthouse, reporters who had once written admiring profiles of the man who ran into the fire now filed very different copy. One tabloid ran the headline, "Hero or Killer?" beside the same photograph the South Wales Echo had used 9 months earlier, a jarring reminder of how quickly a community's story about a person can invert. Sarah remembers standing on the courthouse steps that afternoon, Poppy asleep against her shoulder, Jack gripping her free hand, and thinking that whatever happened next, their family had already lost the version of their life they'd had before the fire, regardless of what any appeal, however many years away, might eventually undo. Inside HMP Park, and later HMP Long Lartin, Daniel Whitfield became known among fellow inmates simply as the Fireman, a nickname that carried, depending on who used it, either grim respect or open disbelief. Prison, notoriously, has its own internal sense of who is guilty of what, and more than one lifer would later tell journalists that Daniel's case never sat right with the wing. A man convicted of killing the very person he'd nearly died trying to save struck even hardened prisoners as an unusually cruel kind of justice. Sarah Whitfield raised Jack and Poppy largely alone, working 2 jobs to keep the household afloat, and made the 6-hour round trip to visit Daniel roughly once a month, often skipping lunch to afford the coach fare. She kept a scrapbook, newspaper clippings, court transcripts, letters from Daniel, that would later become crucial evidence in the campaign to overturn his conviction. It was Jack, only 9 years old at the time of his father's arrest, who became the family's unlikely engine of persistence. By his early teens, he had built a basic website, Justice for Dan, compiling the trial transcript, the ignored doorbell camera footage, and a growing list of forensic scientists willing to review the case pro bono. He would later say that watching his father's case taught him, before he'd even finished secondary school, exactly how fragile certainty can be inside a courtroom, an experience that eventually led him towards studying law. Lily Ainsworth, the 7-year-old girl Daniel had carried out of the fire, grew up with her grandparents, who took over her care after her mother's death. For years, she was told a simplified, painful version of events, that the man who saved her life was also, somehow, responsible for her mother's. It was a contradiction she could never fully reconcile as a child, and one that, as she entered her teenage years, she began quietly investigating on her own, reading old news archives, eventually reaching out to a legal charity that specializes in reviewing potential wrongful convictions. Meanwhile, inside prison, Daniel struggled in ways that rarely made it into any court document. He stopped talking about the fire almost entirely, even to Sarah, unable to reconcile the 4 minutes he remembered, crawling through smoke, finding a terrified child by touch, with the 16-year sentence attached to those same 4 minutes. A prison counselor's notes, later disclosed during the appeal process, described a man who presents as someone punishing himself for a death he did not cause, while simultaneously serving a sentence for causing it. 9 years passed this way: visits, letters, a slowly growing website, a teenage girl quietly reading old newspaper archives in her local library, before any of it would matter to a courtroom again. Daniel marked time the way many long-term prisoners do, through small, structured rituals. He earned a woodworking instructor qualification inside prison, teaching basic carpentry to other inmates in the workshop, the closest thing available to the trade he'd practiced his whole adult life. He kept, folded inside his Bible, a single photograph, Lily Ainsworth's school picture, the same year as the fire, given to him by a sympathetic family liaison officer before contact between the two families was formally discouraged pending appeal proceedings. He looked at it, he later said, whenever he needed to remember that the 4 minutes he actually lived through were real, regardless of what a jury had decided about them. Sarah, for her part, refused for years to let Jack's website use her name or quote her directly, worried that public campaigning might jeopardize a future appeal. It was only in year 7, after the Forensic Science Regulator's office quietly began flagging historic cases that had relied on outdated accelerant testing, that she finally agreed to go on record, a decision that would prove pivotal in getting the case in front of a review panel at all. The breakthrough, when it finally came, arrived not from a single dramatic discovery, but from a slow institutional reckoning. In 2021, the UK's Forensic Science Regulator published a wide-reaching review concluding that several older, presumptive chemical testing methods used in historic arson investigations, including the exact method Graham Pierce had relied on, were no longer considered reliable enough to support a criminal conviction on their own, without corroborating physical evidence. That review, combined with the growing paper trail Jack Whitfield had assembled over a decade, caught the attention of a forensic fire engineering team willing to re-examine the case pro bono. Using modern thermal mapping software, technology that simply did not exist in any practical courtroom-ready form at the time of the original trial, the team reconstructed the fire's heat progression through Rachel Ainsworth's living room, second by second, based on the original scene photographs and surviving structural debris. The reconstruction was unambiguous. The point of maximum heat intensity did not originate behind the sofa where Pierce had focused his sampling. It originated inside the wall cavity directly behind it, at the exact location of an aging 4-socket extension lead that fire safety records showed had never been replaced in over a decade of use. Overloaded and running warm for years, the extension cord's insulation had degraded to the point of arcing, an electrical fault entirely capable of igniting synthetic carpet underlay and producing exactly the kind of volatile hydrocarbon signature Pierce's lab had originally, and wrongly, attributed to an external accelerant. The chemical traces found on Daniel's boots were retested using modern gas chromatography, a far more precise method than had been available at the time of the original trial. The results showed the compounds were consistent with common carpet adhesive residue, not with paint thinner at all. In other words, the supposed match to Daniel's workshop chemicals had been, from the very beginning, a case of two different substances being mistaken for one another by outdated equipment. Lily Ainsworth, now 19, and by this point actively involved in the campaign to reopen the case, stood outside the Court of Appeal building holding a folder of the new forensic reports and told a small gathering of reporters, "The man who saved my life spent 9 years paying for a mistake made by a piece of faulty wiring. I needed people to know the truth, even if it took this long." For the first time in nearly a decade, Daniel Whitfield's case was heading back into a courtroom, this time with the science finally on his side. The forensic engineering team's lead investigator, Dr. Priya Anand, would later describe the moment the thermal reconstruction software rendered its first complete model as one of those rare moments in this job where the data just stops arguing with you. The wall cavity arc fault, she explained in her report, was consistent with a well-documented failure pattern in extension leads manufactured before 2004. A detail investigators 9 years earlier not only failed to test for, but had no real reason to look for, since they had already settled on a suspect and a motive before the physical evidence had been fully explored. Graham Pierce, reached for comment after the case was reopened, did not dispute the new findings. In a brief statement, he said only that forensic fire science has advanced enormously since his original investigation, and that he deeply regretted the outcome for the Whitfield family, an acknowledgement Daniel's legal team welcomed, but one that could not return the 9 years already lost. The Court of Appeal hearing lasted just under 2 days. The Crown, presented with the new thermal mapping evidence, the retested chemical samples, and the previously unexamined doorbell footage, did not seriously contest the findings. The presiding judge, in quashing the conviction, was unusually direct in his written judgment, stating that the original forensic methodology fell substantially below the standard now required to support a safe conviction, and that the original investigation had failed to pursue an obvious and readily testable alternative explanation, namely, Daniel's own workshop as an innocent source of the chemical traces used to convict him. Daniel Whitfield walked out of Long Lartin on a gray Tuesday morning in his own clothes for the first time in 9 years. Waiting for him beyond the gate, in a crowd that included Sarah, Jack, now 22 and in his final year of law school, and Poppy, now 12 and barely able to remember a time when her father wasn't in prison, was one more person Daniel hadn't expected to see. Lily Ainsworth, 19 years old, the little girl he had once carried out of a burning house wrapped in a bedsheet. She crossed the car park at a run and threw her arms around him before either of them said a word. When she finally spoke, according to several reporters present, all she said was, "You saved me. I just wanted to help save you back." Daniel, by his own later account, could not speak at all for almost a full minute. In the months that followed, 7 other arson-related convictions across Wales and England were flagged for review after prosecutors acknowledged that Graham Pierce's testing methodology had been used, unchallenged, in each of those cases as well. New guidance was issued nationally restricting the use of presumptive chemical accelerant testing as standalone evidence in criminal trials, a change that campaigners, including Jack Whitfield, had spent years pushing for and that now bears, informally, at least some connection to his father's case. Daniel returned eventually to his workshop, the same one behind the family home, its tools untouched for nearly a decade, gathering dust that Sarah had never quite been able to bring herself to clear away. He picked furniture restoration back up slowly, he says, because it was one of the only things left in his life that hadn't been reshaped by the trial. Every year, on the anniversary of the fire, Lily calls him. Not to talk about that night, they rarely discuss it directly anymore, but simply to say, in her own words, "Thank you for still being here." Daniel says it's the one phone call he never lets go to voicemail. "I ran into a burning house to save a little girl," Daniel told a reporter outside the Court of Appeal on the day of his release. "I never imagined that walking back out of the fire would only be the beginning of the real fight." Jack Whitfield, now finishing his law degree, has said he intends to specialize in forensic evidence review. Cases exactly like his father's, where outdated science, not malice, quietly destroyed a family for the better part of a decade. Sarah still keeps the scrapbook, though it now sits on a shelf rather than a kitchen table, its purpose finally, mercifully complete. As for Lily, she has said publicly more than once that she doesn't think of Daniel as either a hero or a victim, but simply as the reason she got to grow up at all. "Whatever the courts decided over the years," she told one interviewer, "I always knew somewhere underneath it what actually happened in that room. I just had to wait long enough for everyone else to catch up."